I've spent the majority of my life working in the outdoors as a soldier, outdoorsman, and guide. Many years ago, I came to a crossroad in my military career. I felt like I was at the point where I was no longer able to learn about survival from the military. So I searched and I watched as many new shows popped up like Dual Survival, Survivor Man, and others. Shows that partnered seasoned soldiers with primitive living instructors. I watched experienced soldiers who had amazing skills with tools fall short without them, and I had to look deep within myself and ask why. So, realizing that something was missing in my training, I then formulated a plan. I set out to find people with these skills in my area, to find out who they were, where they come from, who taught them, and more importantly, how could I learn and master these skills for myself. This journey has led me to a place where I have had the privilege of teaching these things that I love to others. Skills that now range from advanced navigation to primitive fire. This is my journey to primitive. This is my story, yet it is a story that has never really been about me.
A knife is an important, portable tool that helps in many ways. Primarily, perhaps, to help you light fires. And people have no idea what you want in a knife. The knife is unobtrusive, not very cumbersome, and when people, it took many years for me to come up with the statement. I said a survival knife must be a pry bar that works wood really well, implying that it's strong enough. A pry bar is meant to pry. A pilot hopes to carry a knife on him when he crashes, has to cut himself out of the cockpit. Will the knife stand that type of abuse? So the knife that's indestructible, it's a full tang and thick enough, and as a result, you get complaint of some people who don't know, they're interested in knives and they study knives and they see all the other knives, and they don't realize that they have not been schooled in how thick the blade is, so you can't break it. Like that K-bar that was issued to the soldiers in the Second World War. If I hit it like this, it's broken. That's all I had. So a knife that's issued to a soldier in combat, that is a very poor. It was so fragile because the tang narrows down, and the guard is on there, and then it goes through the handle, and at that juncture, it was very fragile and vulnerable. But anyway, you realize that the knife that you're carrying is primarily working wood, feather sticks, whatever you want. Let me build the ski shoe. Will it peel the stick effectively if you need to? All the things. If you peel a stick, a green stick, in a remarkable short time, like a couple days, it dries out. And it's half the weight. And it's less noodly. When it dries out, it becomes stiff. You leave the bark on, and it sort of it doesn't have much rigidity. So there is a reason to peel the bark so you can reduce so a peeled ski shoe is half the weight of an unpeeled ski shoe. So you can cut down a tree the thickness of your wrist, and that thickness and below, you can virtually build a lean-to like that. Those poles laying there, you can actually cut down those poles. If you can't bend it, then you use a baton. But all you need is a jack pine. You need a pocket knife to cut down things thin enough to make an arch type shelter, which is freestanding and the easiest way to throw a piece of plastic or piece of canvas or whatever to create a roof, and on and on. So you find that the neat thing is that the maker of this knife is here, Rod Garcia from Whitefish, Montana.
My name is Rod Garcia, and I live in Montana, and started taking classes with Karamat back in about 2002, something like that, and took 3 different classes, took 2 winter courses and 1 summer course, and was very much inspired watching Morse Kochanski work with the little $12 Morse knife. It kind of blew my mind, as a lot of people would say. You know, I came from the old school of Rambo, you know, the big knives with all the saw teeth in the back and all that. And when I got to class and the first day watching Morse cut up materials and make, you know, backpack frames and netting needle boards and all kinds of things like that from this small little knife, it kind of hit me pretty hard, and it made me realize that skill is incredibly important in this whole process. You can't have a magic bullet. And after those classes progressed, I turned out to be a stay-at-home dad. And after several years of changing diapers and wanting to move on in life as far as work goes, because the kids were getting old enough so that I could get more time away and actually get a job. As a side note, I wanted to find a knife that Morse had described in his book in bushcraft. And I happened to be down in Missoula during a knife show, and one of the guys that was running the knife show knew me. We had taken some other classes together. And I told him what I was looking for. I said, there's this type of knife that this guy explains in his book. And he said, well, go look around there and see what you can find. And as the case may be, I didn't find what I was looking for. And he happened to be a knife maker, and he said, well, I'll tell you what, if you want, let's get together sometime in my shop. Maybe we can put something together. And so that kind of put the seed in my head about, you know, maybe making a knife, and since I couldn't find one. And so about a year later, we got together and got out into his shop and cut out some 1095 and played around. And I just was trying to get an idea of just the process. And so we put a knife together. It was kind of an interesting deal because he worked at a sawmill, and we were going at it till about 2 o'clock in the morning, and we were getting to the point of putting a butt plate on there. And he didn't know how to weld. He says, I know a guy that does. And so we went over to one of the local sawmills there in the Flathead Valley. And it's pretty cool that you can show up in one of these places and at 3 o'clock in the morning find the guy who's on the late night shift and says, yeah, come on in, let's weld this thing up. So we did that, and finally got it all put together. And it was pretty much a piece of junk. It was the first one. But I got this little bug in my head. I thought, you know, maybe I can do something with this. And so I started playing with the idea, and I ended up selling a car to start financing the tooling. And so that kind of got the ball rolling. I got more into Morse's book and his section on knives, and I started taking the concept and the parameters that he laid down as far as the basic width and this and that. And I started putting pen to paper and started drawing it out. And as the process went, I was starting to accumulate some tools. I got a grinder first and playing around with that, and had some other people do welding for me, different things. But I came up with about 10 or 12 knives before I got something that was pretty good, that I thought would maybe be something that somebody might like. And so I ended up sending up, before that I went to Rat Root Rendezvous at Karamat in about 2006, as I recall. And I had one of my knives, and I just had it sitting on a table because I was showing some of the other students, and Morse hadn't gotten into a camp yet. And that evening he showed up and saw that knife there, and I was kind of talking with somebody, and grabbed that and said, okay, who did this? Where'd they find this? And I kind of meekly raised my hand and said, well, I did, Morse. And so he said, well, this is the concept that I'm going with in my book. I said, yeah, I know, that's kind of where I was looking for. And I told him the story. I said, you know, I've been trying to find a knife that fit that, and I decided I'd just go ahead and make it. So we sat down and discussed some things. He was kind of excited about it, which, you know, was neat, because it kind of made me feel good about what I was doing. And we talked about some different things and a few little changes here and there. And so I went back to Montana after that meeting, and that winter I produced some more knives. I did some testing. I broke a few just to see what was going on with that, because I was still in the learning process as far as the the heat treat, different things. And by that time I did have a heat treat oven. And so I came up with 5 more knives, and I sent them up to Morse, and it kind of coincided with the winter course that he was putting on.
The size of the knife, you would say that this is 4 fingers, but if you had a knife like in Sweden called the Sloyd knife, it would be 2 fingers. And 90% of all you work in survival, that's what you really need. The knife handle starts there. Everything is close to the effort, the heart, everything. And so you end up getting the effect. So most people think they know something about knives, but they don't realize if you use the knife sufficiently long and whatever, if someone, like, you know, I'm trying to educate you and so on, and pretty soon you would realize what you're looking for, and on and on. So it goes from the size of the knife, its indestructibility, and the variation on the knife is the hole to lash it to a stick and to use as a sickle, lang handle, and it's to cut the grass to use for insulation. And actually you can do a lot of cutting by having that handle, and in Britain for sure, amongst the Himalayan balsam, as they call it, we call it popcorn plant, and in amongst it, it's nice and green, but you don't see in there the concertina wire they call briar in there, and it won't allow you to move unless you chop it up. And having a long handle, you got the speed. And you know, last thing that I would say, well, let's put a long handle to make it into a spear to stab a bear. And maybe if you've got that problem, I never have had the requirement to stab a bear. What makes the knife usable is the configuration allows you to put an exquisite razor's edge on it. And this Scandi grind and the fact of continuous curvature seem to participate in doing that. And the back of the blade is so square and sharp that you can scrape up fine shavings, and it gives me the opportunity to take a metal match rod, and it gives you the strikers that they often accompany the metal match are so inadequate, but this corner, when I strike it, it lights the carpeting on fire or the grass on fire, and it makes people are amazed. Well, they don't realize that the amazement is connected to the fact that those two, and yet when you got the knife sitting there and a knife maker comes and looks at it, well, don't you think it's kind of heavy? Well, it indicates the questions that they ask just haven't used the knife sufficiently to know what sort of a lighter knife. A lot of people think, when I get to know the students and they bring weird knives, they'll say, what do you think of this knife? And if I feel that, I don't want to badmouth a paying student, but I say, and seriously, you realize that design a knife, I snap it, all I have to do is, put it in a circumstance that give it a jerk, you've broken off the knife. Well, if you want durability, maybe you shouldn't abuse your knife, but if you're trapped in a cockpit of an airplane, you appreciate the fact that no matter what you do, you're not going to break the blade. And then on top of that, I would purposely go out and abuse, I would hammer the biggest nails I could drive into a board just to see how much I would damage. Well, this micarta situation, you could do that for a lifetime, and people would hardly see that there's any damage. And then the plate here was, well, the hole here and the plate here, that's two features that you generally, you're striving to make your knife unique. So the hole there, usually I like 3 holes, and the plate welded on, and the size. I would say I've used this knife to the extent that, in spite of all of its features, I am not far wrong that if you choose this as a survival knife, that they won't come back and curse me. But I see in some catalogs, I see these weird knives. They are not really, the acid test of a knife: carve a netting needle and a shuttle in the netting needle in 5 minutes. If your knife doesn't allow you, after the 10th needle, to be carving that needle in 5 minutes, your knife is not up to a knife that should be considered the woodworking aspect of your survival kit. So, and then you drive your knife into a tree sufficiently that you can stand on the handle. And if you weigh 300 pounds, try to break the knife. If the knife doesn't break, well, why would I do that? Well, humanity, there's people that have sort of said that. Why would I do that? I've used my knife. Well, you asked me to see how do you describe the durability of that knife? And Rod, he was, sort of say, that hole that's drilled there, which you stick the knife into a stick of the right kind, you make a notch, and then you stick a nail in there, and you can keep cutting short pieces of wood until the cows come home. And the last time I did a lot of that was I had kids making whistles and recorders, and I would have to cut hundreds of plugs, because they got to pick the plugs and keep trying them until they fit perfectly. Because if they don't fit, if they are too small, they fall out. If they're too big, they crack the pipe, which is a fragile pipe made out of car parsnip, and so on. Well, that's only the practical use for putting a nail in there. Oh, and people go up and, if you use the skin of moose, you're going to get listeria. Well, everybody comes. And people says, hanging your knife around the neck, you're going to one day hang yourself. Well,
sure hasn't happened yet, has it?
Maybe it happens once in 30 years, but that's not my concern. There's other reasons why I have the knife around my neck. And one reason is anybody that wears a knife around their neck might have a connection with me, because they pick up why do you do that? Well, I picked it up from these nurses. There was a survival episode where I ended up teaching 600 nurses, and they all seemed to be carrying their scissors and their knives around their neck. And so I said, well, what? Well, they said the native people we know don't have belts, and they tend to carry their knives. So they sort of naturally, since they're kind of like, good people to emulate, so they carry that. So I adopted, and I said, I did some filming once, 3 days of filming. And as we review the filming, everything I do, I take my knife out of here, do my stuff, and I go there. Instead of going here, the film crew who are watching, somebody said, you probably saved an hour each day for the fact that your knife is around your neck and you're not searching your sheath down here. And the other thing is, if your sheath is here, you're not as conscious as its presence here. So you're less apt to lose it. And then the Camping Club of America, or a prestigious group in the East, they happen to have a habit of carrying their knives. And some people said, oh, you must have got that from the Camping Club of America, whatever the title is. They even had their own flag. And I said, oh, did you get that there? And I wasn't aware until they told me. I could have lied and said, yeah, I got it.
So he brought those knives out during the class, and or at least one of them. And there was a student there from Holland who took pictures of it and was a member of a private forum. And when he got done with that class, he posted pictures of that onto the forum. And so that kind of got some interest on that. But a side note to that is about that same time, I'd been waiting several weeks to hear back from Morse on, these knives that I sent up. Well, I never heard back from him. And I'm kind of thinking, what the heck? I send these knives up there and he's never getting back to me. Well, literally that day I got a call from a writer named Dan Sheckman who wrote for Tactical Knives. And he said, okay, Morse tells me you have a really good knife. Here's the deal. I want to write an article about it, but if I do, it can either make or break you as far as knife makers go. So you're going to have to decide right now what you want to do. And taking on the challenge, I said, what the heck. So I sent him a couple of knives, discussed a little bit about the background and how that went, and that process got started. But then Morse called me up a few days later. He just happened to be up in the Northwest Territories working with a school up there, and we got talking again about it, and I thanked him profusely for telling this individual about my knife and the compliments that he gave for that. And so that was kind of a neat conversation to have with him. But then, about another week later, I get an email from a guy who was running the forum, the private forum. And he said, there's some individuals here that say that you are a knife maker, which at that time I really didn't consider myself one. I didn't even have all my tooling. I had no idea where this was going to go, and I didn't have my process down. But anyways, he said, if you would like to come on this forum, I'm officially inviting you over, but just, we kind of keep things low key here, and this is a private forum. And so I said, well, okay, sure, I'll go check that out. So he gave me the password and everything, got in there. And I found the thread where this individual from Holland had mentioned my knife, and it was many pages long, which was a bit of a shock. And it was kind of entertaining reading through the lines on, who is this guy, where is he from, and we don't know, does he have a phone number, where's his business website, all these things. And like I said, I hadn't even gotten to that point, let alone producing enough knives. I got down through the thread, and I found one post that said, here he is. And I looked on there, and there was a screenshot from Google of my house. And I called my wife over, and I said, look at this. It was a little bit disconcerting, so it made me realize that the world kind of shrunk down real quick that day. But anyways, off that forum is when the first order started up, and people were very interested in it. And it was kind of nice because it was a good group of people in that they gave me some feedback, and there's a few little issues that came up with, with most knife makers, I'm sure we'll find when they first get started. And I had to tweak a few things and change up a few little differences in the pattern. But anyways, by that time, orders started coming in from that group. Well, then the article came out from Tactical Knives, and of course that's history, as they say. It just kind of took off from there. And so I've been pretty much swamped. The final product is this. And ended up coming with that. And so the basic concept that Morse came up with was to have something that he uses a term that's it's just right. It's not too long, it's not too short. We came up with the idea that basically the blade is about hand width. Same thing with a handle area where you're gripping. One of the things that he wanted to have done was to have a pummel plate put on the back, and the main part for this is for pounding into trees, but also for cutting a tree down. You can take a knife about this size, and if it's strong enough in the back end, you can take down small trees about that big around. And the idea behind that is that if you're out in the woods and you happen to get lost, or you have to build a quick shelter, is that you need to have a ridge pole to do a lean-to. And by taking this knife, and if the tree is set up like this, you're going to pound it in, and then you're going to work it back and forth. Pull it out, and you'll just keep doing that, repeating that process all the way around the tree. And by the time you get to the other side, there's not much left in the middle, and you just push it over. And so it's a pretty handy tool. This one also has a divot in here for running a bow drill. This is something that Kelly Harrelton came up with and asked me about, and we figured that out quick and decided to put that in there as an option. The main points of the knife are obviously the butt plate, also the two lashing holes here. This is to put onto a stick, but it's not necessarily for making a spear. It's for using it almost like a scythe if you're having to cut grass, give you reach. If you're in the northern forest where you've got birch trees, it gives you reach so you can reach up and cut through the bark to pull off birch bark to be making tools, or different bowls and things like that. Basically, I use 3 different types of steels, O1, A2, and 3V. I found those to be a pretty good compromise across the board. Also use obviously the Scandinavian grind, and which works really good for carving, but also for making feather sticks. It's one of the critical points of bushcraft and being in a, hopefully not ever happen, but being in a survival situation. I find that this type of grind probably gives you the best feather sticks because of the flat face And also the fact that it's probably 600-700 years old. Vikings started building this basic knife, something similar to that, a long time ago, and if it worked that long, I figured it'd probably work good for us too. So,
Yeah, well, I tell people, I say, look at that, take a picture of it. If you're wondering, compare this configuration, which is sharp corners on the back, scanty grind, continuous curvature. Ignore the hole. You got holes in the handle. I hadn't seen Rod Garcia. I was going to suggest, why are you making rivets when maybe you put 3 holes to take the rivets? Well, there's 3 rivets. Well, 3 holes instead of making so many holes. So putting the brass liner in there and the epoxy is sufficient to keep and then he etches MK on the knife. That means Morse Kochanski. That he's got inside of a Roycroft pack frame etched on there, and then he says MK. Well, the Skookum, and it made quite a sensation when it came, out in the public, and a lot of people figured I designed it. But I said no. Rod would keep coming on the courses, and each time he brought a prototype. And when I saw the prototype, Rod has got the professional equipment to make a knife that way. Rod was a house painter who's married to a lady who made a very good living, so he became the housewife, and then he came up. I don't know how he came up with the idea to become a knife maker, but he happened to ask my opinion, and he came up with this. And I said, without Rod doing that, I wouldn't. I never sat down on a drafting table and drafted a knife, and I said, Rod, make this knife. No, he kept bringing knife and asked, what do you think? What do you think? So the end result there. And it just happened that my notoriety and my insights, I had a knife chapter in Bushcraft, which I published 32 years ago. And when that book got into the hands of the most eminent survival instructor in Finland, Turku Aaltonen, who I met in the conference that Lars was involved in 1995. But before that, when my book came out, Turku phoned me and said, I must talk to the person that has such a good knife chapter, because I have not seen in the English language anyone that devoted. And yet on the internet, there was people, 23 pages on knives, I could live without that. Well, I stopped reading on the internet because there were assholes that would rile me on account of their lack of insight. This one guy, he figured, you don't need any knife training. You can just pick it up naturally. Well, when I was dealing with the thousands of students, I saw a lot of blood, and I couldn't. Felt I don't want to defend myself from an idiot. So why should I answer? I didn't bother. It'll take care of itself.
Yeah, the other parts about it, and this is something else that I know some of my customers complain about every once in a while. Because I put what's called what Morse calls a micro Tanto tip on the front, and people don't like that because they don't tell me outright, but I think it's because they don't like the look of it. But there's 2 reasons for doing that. One is to strengthen the tip, because you're bringing the tip back, and it's very thin, especially when it comes off my grinder. And it's very easy to break that off. Now, Morse discovered this idea by breaking the tips off of knives, from what he told me. And he showed me some demonstration knives that he had. And what happened was he would break them off because the steel that he was using at the time, he was kind of having to compromise because this idea hadn't come out yet and there weren't any knife makers making this. And so he'd go and take all this time and sharpen them and try to bring that sharp tip back. Well, one day he thought, boy, I'm spending a lot of time doing this. This is kind of ridiculous. How about if I just sharpen the end of that and just leave it as is? And what he found was that all of a sudden he created a second cutting edge. And basically what that Tanto tip does is give you a gouge so you can actually cut through material this way rather than trying to have to depend on that. So if you're trying to cut small grooves, in a stick if you're trying to cut the hole out when you're putting a lashing in there for your bow drill, or if you're making a netting needle, something along that line. But also, it like I said, it makes it quite a bit tougher, and it changes nothing in the carving ability. It looks a little bit goofy, but you know what? It's very functional, and so I do that to all my knives. And this one is about 1/8 of an inch, and I've taken it back even further than that. It's really not a problem, but you know, to each their own. So, but I do suggest people doing that, especially with a scanty grind, is to go and put that on their bush knives. As far as the material goes in the handles, I use micarta. I pick micarta because it's good, it's tough, it's inert more or less. It's not affected by cold weather, rain, anything like that. I've had a few requests for wood, but I don't want to put wood on this because I don't think it's stable enough and tough enough if you're going to be using the pummel plate, as far as pounding on it and using them that way. And also, wood eventually can split. People notice the number of pins that I've got in here. I try to make sure that the handle material is going to stay on. It's never going to come off. But I also ended up putting the rear pin back here to increase stability and strength in the back part of the knife, especially again with using the pummel plate. Some people want to have just one lanyard hole. I suggest going 2 all the time. The first one doesn't do anything, doesn't hurt anything. It just adds a little extra to the knife, one more option as far as what you're going to use. As far as the sheath goes, I use 10 to 12 ounce skirting leather. And what's a little bit unique about it is that I followed one of the traditional Scandinavian style sewing methods. I sew it up through the back, but it's in a folded position. Then I water soak it and shape it. And I've got a tool that creates this ridge right here so that it increases some stiffness in the front part of the sheath. And then after that, I'll do a dye when I dry it. I'll dye it quick, and then I'll run it through molten beeswax. And what that does is it seals up the leather, but it also causes, from the research I've done, it causes a polymerization of the cells inside of the leather, and makes it stiff, makes it hard, which is good to have. And again, like I said, waterproof. And you can also form the sheath so that it creates a locking position that it prevents the blade from coming out, yet you can still pull it out. I went with neck carry just because that was kind of the traditional method, and that's what Morse does, and since I'm a student of his, what the heck, I'll follow that. The knife is a little bit heavy for that. I end up making my neck cordage a little bit thicker and wider so it's not cutting into the back of your neck. But it can be put on your belt too. You can just take the cordage, slip it behind your belt, slip it over, do that multiple times. So you're basically creating a prusik knot. And that way you can have it set up just like a dangler. That works just fine. As far as maintenance goes, just like any other knife, it's one of those things that depends on the steel per se, but this one is 01, 01A2 or high carbon tool steels. And it's always a good idea to throw a little bit of oil on there. As far as the oils that I use, you can use vegetable oils. I also use baby oil, especially when I'm sharpening stones. And it's more of an economic thing with me. Honing oil is mineral oil, baby oil is mineral oil. But when you buy a can of honing oil like that for $5, when I can buy a bottle of baby oil this big for $2, $3, it's the same thing. And I think the baby oil also is being USP certified, has been clarified and cleaned up, so you don't have to worry about any impurities getting in your skin. But I'll just put a little coating on there quick. But as far as stains go, I don't worry about that. It just adds to the character of the knife. As far as the sheath goes, you don't have to do much to this. If you're using it, it stays burnished like this. One thing that customers have asked about is that they've put it in their dresser, which is a big mistake. You need to be using these things. But if you put it in the dresser and it sits there for 3 or 4 months, you'll notice a kind of a white frosting color coming out that. And basically what that is the beeswax. It's starting to crystal over. And the easy thing you do is just grab a hairdryer and just run it on there. It all melts. It turns back, sheen comes back, and it makes it look new again. So, or you could use a cigarette lighter. Just don't scorch it, but just a little bit of heat on there, and it blends all that back. Another thing you can do along those lines, if you were having issues with the sheath is starting to get a little loose, pulling the knife in and out, is pull the knife out, heat it up with a blow dryer, and then press down in this area just ahead of the front of the scales. You can see where that bump coincides with this bump here on the front of the scales. And by heating that up and then pressing on that and holding it as it cools, you'll kind of rejuvenate that area in there so that you can lock the knife back in. Okay, well, when you're a person, and this is my opinion, and it's fairly biased but narrow. One thing I did learn in the process of making their knives, you want to come up with what I call the knife triad, knife maker's triad or whatever. First of all, decide what it's for. Okay, you know, and unfortunately a lot of people think what somebody else is going to be using things for, and when I mention my knives, they say, oh, how's it for skinning? Well, it works good for skinning. It's not a great skinning knife, but it works because that's not its intended purpose, even though it's a general purpose knife. So you want to decide on what the knife is for. Then you want to have the design match that usage, okay? And when you do that, then you want to match the steel to the design. And then if you're making them yourself, or if you're talking to a custom knife maker, at least in my opinion, you want to see that they are having the heat treat match the steel. Some people that are just getting started in their garages, you know, they have their systems, they're quenching in different kinds of oils and things, and they're picking that stuff up out of, you know, motor oil or vegetable oils, and that's fine. But if you want to have a really good product that you're paying good money for, you want to make sure that that heat treat is matched up. I follow industry standards as far as the heat treat goes, and it's not magic, but it's something that the industry has developed over the years and spent lots and lots of money. So for me to try and come up with some voodoo magic back in my garage, you know, it's fun, but if you really want to have a serious product, you know, I think it's better to just follow those three main points as far as your choice of knives.